One act of kindness can change everything. A lonely farmer gave water to a thirsty Comanche girl, and the next day, her entire tribe surrounded his farm. What happened next will leave you speechless. Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Let's get started. The sun pressed down on the Texas plains like a hammer, unrelenting and merciless. Elijah Boone, a 30-year-old farmer hardened by work and loneliness, trudged from his well carrying 2 buckets of water. Life had taught him silence more than words, and most days the only sounds he heard were the creak of the windmill and the rustle of prairie grass. That afternoon, as he wiped sweat from his brow, he saw movement near the fence line. A figure stumbled forward, young, barefoot, her dress torn from travel. For a moment Elijah thought the heat was playing tricks on his eyes, but then she drew closer, her steps faltering. It was a Comanche girl, no more than 22, her face streaked with dust, her lips cracked from thirst. Her dark eyes held both defiance and exhaustion, as if she would rather collapse than beg. Elijah froze, torn between fear and instinct. In these lands, encounters with Comanche were often whispered with dread, but what he saw was not an enemy. It was a human being, desperate for water. Without a word, he lifted the wooden bucket, extending it toward her, his heart thundering in the silence of the prairie. She hesitated, her gaze flickering between him and the bucket, as if weighing whether to trust him. The air hung heavy, a single breath away from collapse. Finally, with trembling hands, she took the bucket and lifted it to her lips. Water spilled down her chin as she drank, each swallow loud in the stillness. Elijah stood rooted, saying nothing, only watching as strength returned to her shoulders. When at last she lowered the bucket, her voice came out cracked, fragile as wind through dry grass. "Thank you." 2 words, simple yet powerful enough to pierce Elijah's lonely heart. Elijah nodded slowly, not trusting his voice. He wasn't a man used to speaking much, let alone to strangers. He reached into the pouch, slung at his belt, and pulled out a piece of coarse bread, holding it out. Again she hesitated, suspicion flickering in her gaze, but hunger betrayed her. She accepted, chewing carefully as though unsure whether to savor or hide the act. Elijah studied her quietly, noticing the weariness in her stance, the dignity she refused to let go of. Whoever she was, she hadn't come here by choice. Something, or someone, had driven her into the unforgiving plains. The girl wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and though she remained guarded, there was no hatred in her eyes, only wariness. Elijah cleared his throat, finally breaking his silence. "You're safe here," he said softly, though the words felt strange in his mouth. She gave no answer, only watched him with a quiet intensity that made him shift uneasily. For a fleeting moment, Elijah felt as though he stood at a crossroads he didn't fully understand. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the horizon in fire. He turned, motioning toward his cabin. She followed at a cautious distance, steps dragging but determined. The small log cabin stood simple yet sturdy, the only shelter for miles. Elijah pushed the door open, letting the cool shade spill over them. He placed the bucket by the hearth, filling a smaller bowl and setting it before her. She crouched, dipping her hands into the water and pressing it against her face, relief softening her features. Elijah leaned against the wall, arms folded, unsure of what to say. He knew nothing of her world and she nothing of his. Yet here they were, bound by survival. When she finished, she settled near the fire pit, her knees pulled close to her chest. Elijah busied himself with the evening chores, cutting kindling, tending to the livestock, setting a pot of beans to simmer. But his eyes kept returning to her. The cabin had always felt too large for one man, echoing with the emptiness of nights spent alone. Yet now, with her quiet presence filling the space, it felt different. Not complete, not yet, but less hollow. He wondered if she would leave at dawn, vanish into the plains, or if she would remain just long enough to heal. As night settled over the farm, the sound of coyotes echoed faintly in the distance. Elijah sat across the fire from her, bowl of beans in his hand. He offered another to her, and after a pause, she accepted, eating in silence. The firelight cast soft shadows across her face, illuminating the strength beneath her exhaustion. When her eyes met his, something unspoken passed between them, neither trust nor rejection, but recognition. They were two souls from different worlds, brought together not by choice, but by need. Elijah felt something stir within him, a quiet voice that whispered of change. When the meal was done, she gathered her blanket, a worn piece of cloth tied to her waist, and laid it near the hearth. Elijah blinked, surprised, but said nothing. He climbed into his own bed, the wooden frame creaking under his weight. The cabin grew quiet, the only sound the crackle of dying embers. Elijah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind restless. Who was she? Where had she come from? Would her people come searching for her? He did not know. All he knew was that tonight, for the first time in years, he did not feel utterly alone. The girl's breathing grew steady, drifting into sleep, but Elijah remained awake long into the night. The stars outside burned bright, and the prairie wind whispered through the cracks in the walls. He turned onto his side, his gaze lingering on her resting figure. She had whispered thank you, fragile and fleeting, but it had been enough to stir something inside him he thought long dead. Elijah Boone, the man who had lived only for soil and survival, had found a reason to wonder again. And as he closed his eyes, he realized that his life had quietly shifted forever. Morning thunder shook the earth before the sun had fully risen. It was not the sound of storm clouds rolling over the plains, but the pounding of hooves, swift, heavy, relentless. Dust spiraled upward, coating the horizon in a haze. Elijah Boone stepped onto his porch, his hands instinctively tightening around the wooden post. His farm, his small piece of fragile solitude, was surrounded. The sight stole his breath. Comanche riders, a full circle of warriors, their painted faces fierce, their spears glinting like shards of the rising sun. His heart hammered in his chest. He had no weapon, no chance. The circle tightened, horses snorting and stamping, warriors' eyes sharp and unyielding. Elijah felt the weight of judgment pressing down on him. This was not a chance encounter, this was reckoning. He had offered water to one of their own, a choice he thought simple, human. Yet he now realized that mercy was never without consequence. The lead rider, broad-shouldered, his chest painted with streaks of red and black, lifted his spear high. Elijah braced himself, every instinct screaming to run, though he knew escape was impossible. His land was small, his walls thin. There was nowhere to hide. And then from among them she appeared, the girl he had found by his well, the girl whose lips had been cracked with thirst, whose pride had kept her from begging, rode forward. Only she was not the weak figure he remembered. She sat tall on the horse's back, her hair tied, her gaze fierce and commanding. The warriors parted for her, as if recognizing authority beyond her years. Elijah's chest tightened at the sight. She was no longer a stranger clinging to survival. She was part of something vast, a people united behind her. She raised her hand, pointing toward him. Elijah's stomach twisted. For one terrible moment, he thought she had marked him for death, that her gesture was a sentence, not recognition. His breath hitched, his hands curling into fists, though he had no weapon, no defense but his courage. But then her voice rang out across the circle, sharp and swift in her native tongue. The words were foreign, yet the tone carried like fire, strong and unwavering. The warriors' eyes shifted, their expressions softening as though a storm had broken into sunlight. Slowly, one by one, the spears lowered. The air, thick with danger, eased into something else entirely. The chief dismounted, his boots striking the earth with authority. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate, his gaze never leaving Elijah's. Elijah stood frozen, his body taut with uncertainty. Then the chief did something Elijah never expected. He placed a hand over his chest, bowing his head slightly, a gesture of respect. Elijah blinked, uncomprehending. Respect? For him, for what? He had only given water, shared bread, opened his porch to a stranger. Yet here stood a man of power, acknowledging him not as an enemy, but as something else. Elijah's throat tightened. He had not only saved a life, he had changed something deeper. The girl, Elijah, remained on her horse, her eyes fixed on Elijah. This time there was no mistrust, no hesitation. There was promise, a bond unspoken but undeniable. Elijah understood in that gaze that she had spoken for him, vouched for him, perhaps even saved his life in return. Her people now looked at him not as a threat, but as a man worthy of respect. Elijah's chest rose and fell, heavy with relief. His knees felt weak, though he forced himself to stand straight, to meet the moment with dignity. Fate had drawn a circle around him, and somehow he belonged inside it. The riders murmured among themselves, their voices carrying across the still air. Elijah could not understand their words, but he felt the weight of them, the rhythm of decision-making, the exchange of thoughts that would determine his future. The chief turned, speaking firmly, then gestured toward Elijah's well. Elijah dismounted, her movements fluid, and approached him slowly. For the first time she smiled, small, fleeting, but real. She touched the wooden bucket by the well, then placed her hand over her heart. Elijah understood the gesture, even without words. He had given her life, and in return, she had given him trust. The warriors began to disband, their circle breaking into motion. Horses turned, dust lifted, but not before many of them gave Elijah a final glance, a measure of respect, cautious but present. Elijah stood rooted in place, his breath ragged. The chief mounted once more, raising a hand as if in farewell. And then, in a storm of dust and thunder, the Comanche riders disappeared into the horizon, leaving Elijah alone once again. Alone, but changed. His farm was quiet, the stillness returning, yet it no longer felt the same. Something had shifted, something larger than his own solitude. Elijah lingered. She stood by the well, her presence calm, her eyes never leaving him. Elijah stepped closer, unsure of what to say, unsure of what words could carry the weight of what had just passed. Finally he managed, his voice low. "You spoke for me." She tilted her head, then nodded once, her expression steady. He wanted to ask why, wanted to understand the bond that had formed so quickly between them. But perhaps some things did not need explaining. Perhaps kindness did not need reason. Her gaze told him all he needed, that from one act a bridge had been built. That night, Elijah sat on his porch again, the memory of the riders vivid in his mind. The dust, the thunder, the fear, all of it had led to something unexpected. His life, once marked only by toil and silence, now carried a thread of destiny woven through it. Elijah sat by the well, her silhouette quiet under the stars. He thought of her words, the strength in her voice when she had spoken to her people. He realized then that she was not a burden, nor a passing stranger. She was a turning point, and somehow she had chosen him. The Texas land stretched wide, the sky endless above them. Elijah Boone, once a farmer with nothing but soil and silence, now held something greater, a bond with a people he had once known only from afar, and the unspoken promise of a future he could not yet see. From a single act of mercy, fate had found him.